بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولي الصالحين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين ثم أصلي وأسلم على مبعوث رحمة للعالمين يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أما بعد يقول الله سبحانه وتعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جاءتكم جنود فأرسلنا عليهم ريحا وجنودا لم تروها وكان الله بما تعملون بصيرا إذ جاءوكم من فوقكم ومن أسفل منكم وإذ زاغت الأبصار وبلغت القلوب الحناجر وتظنون بالله الظنونا هنالك ابتلي المؤمنون وزلزلوا زلزالا شديدا. My dear respected brothers and sisters in Islam, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Ahzab the blessing and the favor that He bestowed upon the believers in the battle of the trench. The battle of the trench, also known as the battle of the Confederates, Al-Ahzab. And this took place in the 5th year after the hijrah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the month of Shawwal. And the reason why these different tribes came together and congregated was because there was a group of Jews or a tribe called Bani Nadir, whom the Prophet ﷺ previously had a covenant with, an agreement. And they broke it, and the Prophet ﷺ expelled them from Al-Madinah to Khaybar. So once they seen that the Muslims became very successful and they were growing in number, for the hate and the envy that they had for the Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says about the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews, وَدَّ كَثِيرٌ مِّنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ لَوْ يَرُدُّونَكُمْ مِّن بَعْدِ إِيمَانِكُمْ كُفَّارًا حَسَدًا مِّنْ عِنْدِ أَنفُسِهِمْ. He talks about the people of the books, the Jews and the Christians, and he mentions that they would love for you, they would love from the Muslims to return back from Islam, from Iman. Why? Because of envy that they have for the Muslims. So this tribe called Bani Nadir, they went to the leaders of Quraysh. They made their way to Mecca and they met with the leaders of Quraysh. And they reminded them of what took place in the battle of Badr, what took place in the battle of Uhud, to rage a fire in their hearts. And they told them that we are going to stand in front of you as we are sick of Muhammad and the Muslims, and we want to take over Medina. As they said, نَسْتَأْصِلُهُمْ, يعني we want to remove Islam from its core. Then what did the Quraysh say? They asked them, who is more beloved, who is more guided? Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam or us? And this Banu Qurayza, knowing that Quraysh were pagans and that they worshipped idols, it did not stop them from saying that you are more guided than the believers. And then they started to prostrate to the idols, showing them that they were serious. Then Quraysh responded to their promise and they agreed to help them. Then they went to another tribe that was in Mecca called Ghatfan, and they said the same thing to them. And they also responded to their call. Quraysh was led by Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, and Ghatfan was led by Ubayd ibn Husn. So both of these armies, alongside some of the Jewish armies, they came together to destroy the Muslims. They were 10,000 in number. When the Prophet ﷺ found out about this, he ordered his companions to dig a trench. And this trench was inspired by the Sahabi Salman al-Farisi. The Muslims worked hard night and day to make this a reality. Once the Confederates arrived to Medina, some of them they sat and they camped to the east of Al-Medina. And some of them they camped next to Mount Uhud, just as they did in the battle of Uhud. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions, when they came upon you from on top and also beneath you. Then the Prophet ﷺ, he had a small number of believers with him. Some of the scholars say 3,000 and some say, in other sources, there were 700. So the believers, they faced the enemy, and behind them was a mountain called Salf, which was going to protect them from the back. And they placed the women and the children in a fortitude away from any danger in the city of Al-Madinah. Bani Khurayza, which was another tribe that lived in Medina, they had a covenant with the Prophet ﷺ. They did not break it at this point until one of Bani Nadir's chiefs came to them and tried to conspire. He began to tell them that we have an army of 10,000. Come and join us. And by the time he left, they were ready to stand with the Confederates against the Prophet ﷺ. So Muhammad ﷺ, he knew that there was a tribe, a Jewish tribe, that was going to help them if anything occurred from the east of Medina. But now they have broken this covenant. So the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba were seriously concerned. And the matter became very intense. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, هُنَالِكَ بَتُلِيَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. And now the believers have been tested. This was a test by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to see those truthful ones. So they besieged the Muslims within Medina for about 1 month. Within this month, the Muslims in this trench did not have any water, no drink. Rather, they were experiencing a famine, poverty. There was no food for them to eat, no drink for them to have, except very little. And they'll be working the night, digging, and by day. And now knowing that there's an army coming to them, ready to destroy them and to take everything that they own. And then there was a group of people, the munafiqeen, the hypocrites. And they would always try to leave and to make excuses so they do not fight. And they say, يَقُولُونَ إِنَّ بُيُوتَنَا عَوْرًا. They would say, our houses are in danger. وَمَا هِيَ بِعَوْرًا. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, no, your houses are not in danger. إِن يُرِيدُونَ إِلَّا فِرَارًا. And in reality, what they really want is to run away and to leave the Muslims as they left them in the battle of Uhud. Many hearts of the believers was in fear. It was filled in fear and doubt and also anxiety. And they were left in a state of hunger. To the extent where the Prophet ﷺ, he tied 2 rocks to his stomach. And the Sahaba would wrap around their bellies rocks also. Until Jabir ibn Abdullah came to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked him about his situation. And he seen that the Prophet ﷺ was very weak. So he lived very close to where the trench was situated. So he went to his house and he asked his family, do we have anything to give to the Prophet ﷺ? And then his wife, she brought what she could from the things that they had inside the house. And he presented it to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ, out of delight and joy, he called upon the Sahaba. From 3,000 to 700. And he said to them, Jabir's family has brought food. Jabir's family has brought food. So every single one of them will come. And he will give them a portion of food until every single one of them was satisfied. And this was from the mu'jizat, the miracles of the Prophet ﷺ. Then there was a man called Amir ibn Abdul Wud. He happened to come over the trench and he was facing the Muslims and he was ready to destroy them. And he was known to be a courageous man in pre-Islamic era. So the Prophet ﷺ, he looked at the Sahaba and he told them, who is going to stand and battle this man? Who is going to stand and fight this man? Until no one stood up. Then Ali radiallahu anhu, he said, I will stand up, O Prophet of Allah. And this man was someone that was feared. Except Ali radiallahu anhu, لا يخاف لومة لائم. He is not scared. He does not fear the blame from the blamers. And he stood up and he went for a long period of time this battle. Until Ali radiallahu anhu was victorious in this combat. And the Muslims from there, after going through anxiety, stress, being in a state of fear, through this battle that Ali had, and this victory that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him, He gave them hope. He gave them hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to protect them. And the affair of the believers, even though they were in a time of difficulty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He describes them to be, and He says, وَلَمَّا رَأَى الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الْأَحْزَابِ. And when the believers, they see in the Confederates, these different groups that came together, قَالُوا هَذَا مَا وَعَدَنَا اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ. That this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam informed us of, what they promised us. And they said, وَصَدَقَ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger are ever so truthful. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after everything that happened, after being sieged in the winter, in the fierce winter of Medina, where they felt hopeless, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, after all of this, the thing that kept them strong is their iman and their submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we find ourselves and we find our brothers and sisters globally in a very distressed time. So how does the Muslim deal with this? What should the Muslim, how is the outlook of the believer when he sees adversity and calamity befalling the ummah? It's very important that every single one of us reads the Quran and looks at what the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba went through. Because did they go through adversities? Yes, they did. Until the Sahaba came to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, when is victory? When are we going to be successful? And he said to them, أَمْ حَسِبْتُمْ أَن تَدْخُلُوا الْجَنَّةَ وَلَمَّا يَعْلَمِ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا مِنْكُمْ وَيَعْلَمَ الصَّابِرِينَ. Do you think you enter Jannah? سِلْعَةُ اللَّهِ الْغَالِيَةِ. The greatest thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the believers, or has prepared for the believers, and you won't be tested? Then he said he said, until you are tested, and you prove yourself, and you are patient, only then will you see the victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We find in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that he says, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ النَّصْرَ مَعَ الصَّبْرِ. That victory is with patience. وَأَنَّ الْفَرَجَ مَعَ الْكَرْبِ وَأَنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. That with difficulty comes ease. And the Prophet ﷺ also says, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ الْأُمَّةَ لَوْ اجْتَمَعَتْ عَلَى أَنْ يَنْفَعُوكَ بِشَيْءٍ لَمْ يَنْفَعُوكَ بِشَيْءٍ إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَكَ. That if the whole nation, the whole world was to come to aid you, to help you, to support you, if Allah did not decree it, it would never happen. وَلَوْ اجْتَمَعُوا. And the opposite, if they were to come to harm you, لَنْ يَضُرُّوكَ بِشَيْءٍ إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَهُ اللَّهُ عَلَيْكَ. And if they were to come and to harm you, and they will come together to conspire against you, as happened to the Muslims in the battle of Al-Ahzab, then no, nothing will harm you except that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written. Then he said, رُفِعَتِ الْأَقْلَامِ. That the pens have been lifted. وَصَفَّتِ الصُّحُفِ. And the scrolls have become dry. So the Muslim must stay patient, must make dua for his brothers and sisters, and increase in ibadah, increase in dua, and whatever form of help he can give his brothers and sisters. And know that with a little bit of patience, inshallah, the victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will come. قولوا قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه كان غفورا رحيما. الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين. I repeat again these ayat so we can ponder over them. In this battle, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, O you who believe, اذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ. Remember the bounties of Allah upon you. إِذْ جَاءَتْكُمْ جُنُودٌ, when an army came that was much greater than you, bigger in number. فَأَرْسَلْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ, then we sent to them, رِيحًا وَجُنُودًا, we sent to them wind, and likewise an army that they could not see. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the angels to aid them. كَانَ اللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرًا. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding us that He sees the oppression of the oppressor. إِذْ جَاءُوكُم مِّن فَوْقِكُم, they came from everywhere, from the right, from the left. وَمِنْ أَسْفَلَ مِنْكُمْ وَإِذْ زَاغَتِ الْأَبْصَارِ, to the extent where their eyes started to play with them. وَبَلَغَتِ الْقُلُوبَ الْحَنَاجِرَ, and their hearts came to their necks out of fear. وَتَظُنُّونَ بِاللَّهِ الظَّنُونَ, and you think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to aid you, He's not going to help you. Then He says, هُنَالِكَ بَتُلِيَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, and here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests the believers. وَزُلْزِلُوا زِلْزَالًا شَدِيدًا, and He sent to them, or He shook them a great shaking. So let us remember these ayat in times of adversity and hard times, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for our brothers and sisters that are facing difficult times in Palestine, and especially in Gaza.